Hello and welcome to this much poorer quality video. This is just gonna be an MP3 file and it's just gonna be me blathering on onto this very crappy quality headset microphone about a thing that happened. And that thing is a debate I got into on Twitter. Now, the debate I had was with Mark Pellegrino and a couple of his followers. And Mark Pellegrino, if you don't know, is a staunch Ayn Rand following capitalist. Nice guy. He was completely cordial through this entire thing. There were people who were toxic, and he was not one of them. I was more toxic than he was. I was the worst person in this debate. So, like, on those grounds, fuck me before you fuck him up. I need to rephrase that. But, yeah. Um, I got into this debate just haphazardly wandered into it. I don't know these people. Like, I don't know Mark Pellegrino. I didn't know him before the debate. And I'm actually going to go watch Supernatural in a bit because apparently he's in it. Um, yeah, so I also had the video that I put out also today in my head and I was putting it together. I actually put that together during the fasts. And in the spirit of that, I engaged as much as I could with this debate in the spirit of taking down these cellular membranes between socialist and capitalist, these ideological poles, and making humanity just one big loop of ideas. As far as lofty as those ideals are, I didn't think I was going to solve it, but I thought I should at least practice what I preach, which is what this video is, and what I did. Uh, I did learn a fair bit, so there's that. There was jargon in our own in philosophy, and I think if I didn't teach any of the philosophical jargon, or at least the academic philosophical jargon, I learned the objectivist jargon to some degree. I learned that altruism, or the way an objectivist would use the word altruism when talking about economics and stuff like that, is not the way I would use it. And when they use the word, I say they, I don't want to be as broad brush as that, but when an objectivist uses a term like that, is usually in reference to an ego, not in terms of selfless and selfishness. Um, yeah, and even when they use the word selfish, it's usually has very different connotations. So I learned to be more sensitive to that and to be more appreciative of that. And I think that it allows me to humanize those ideas more because I found the ideas of altruism and selfishness and in objectivism to be morally abhorrent before this discussion, and now I find them to be a little more human, a lot more human actually, and I think that's a good thing. I think I'm not convinced of it. I've not been, I've not been taken out of my opinions. I've not been convinced against anything. I'm still a socialist, or as much a socialist as I can be. I'm still learning economics. I'm not a big economic buff or anything. I'm not bad mouse. I'm much more of a metaphysics guy, and I'm much more of a Kantian epistemological guy. I learned a lot of Arabic philosophy, so I'm much more of a Mulla Sadra Avicenna guy. Economics is a very new thing to me. So much so that I'm taking myself out of the market and applying to army positions. Yeah, that's a thing. There was some aspects of the discussion that I'll get into first, and these were the aspects that I thought were overwhelmingly negative and were not productive for anything. And I think the first one was something that pervaded the entire discussion, and it was the charge of negativism. Now I know what negativism means in a scientific context. I know what positivism means in a scientific context, and I also know that people like to use those terms in very different ways. And apparently the charge of negativism was a charge that it was bad that I was critiquing Rand because she had a framework and I was critiquing a framework, and therefore I wasn't accepting that frameworks were a thing, which was just wrong. Like I agree more with Kant than I did with Rand. I posited anarcho-syndicalism later, and that's a framework. I defended Marx. You can't defend Marx and not accept frameworks as the thing. I mean, come on. It was just wrong on that score. It's wrong scientifically. That's not how scientifically that term is used. So yeah, just uh, there was also the idea that demonstration is not a logical point. I got into a very specific example. I was trying to apply, I was trying to point out my position by applying the Randian position to a specific scenario, and a very specific scenario at that, something I read up about. And there was an argument that I was bogging people down in specifics and not talking about ideas. Now, that flies in the face of basically 3,000 years of knowledge. Aristotle was the person who came up with the idea that demonstration is the highest form of logical argument. So if you have a problem with that, take that up with Aristotle and logic, not me. Like, Jesus. I mean, I'm being very dismissive, but there were good arguments made by the other side. But just Jesus, that was a really bad one. Um, and I'll deal with the first topic in a topic that I considered to be an argument where the other side didn't have anything. And this was the Native American argument. And this was somebody brought up Ayn Rand's racist tendencies. I don't think her racism. I think she was racist. I don't think her racism has anything to do with her ideas. I think you can be racist and have good ideas. I think secondary characteristics, secondary properties, that's a good idea. And John Locke had it. And John Locke is a horrifying racist. Horrifying. Was a horrifying racist. He's long since dead, but horrifying. Um, yeah, like I think Mills had some good points, and he was a horrifying racist. Horrifying, just terrible. You don't even know, like God. Uh, there's a lot of classical Arabic thinkers who were horrifying racists who had very weird, like very progressive insights. Like Ibn Taymiyyah is the primary influence of Islamofascism, but he also was one of the first people to conceive of aliens. Like there's, I don't think that calling somebody racist means that everything they did is wrong, because they also breathed as well. Like we can be a little more pinpoint and accurate with our criticisms, and but specifically with Rand on Native Americans, her position was basically the same as a Stefan Molyneux, and my position is basically the same as Shaun and Jen's, which is a video that I will link in the description, and one that I actually tweeted directly during this argument. But the historical record is patently against that argument, that there was no genocide and the Native Americans were no angels. For one, I don't like that argument in the first place. They weren't angels. What does that mean? That only angels deserve recompense? Only angels deserve justice? That you have to be truly, morally, absolutely clear to be worthy of justice? That's horrifying. But at the same time, just the record, and the one thing that I went into in detail because one, Shaun and Jen brought it up, but there's an aspect that Shaun and Jen didn't bring up, and that was, what was the Sand Creek Massacre in its time? The Sand Creek Massacre was a horrifying genocidal act where Native Americans who had surrendered, who had no weapons, women and children on the most part, who had treaties with the US government, were just butchered en masse, just killed, and their scalps sold. Infants cut out of the wombs of their pregnant mothers to be scalped. That happened. That incident happened. That genocidal, horrific incident happened during the Civil War. Lincoln was fighting the Civil War when that happened, and Lincoln was the guy who pardoned the governor who perpetrated that massacre specifically to eliminate Native Americans, specifically for genocide. So, like it doesn't gel with the opinion that there was no genocide. It doesn't defend, like, Rand is just wrong, and in its own time it was horrific. It wasn't. You can't use the argument that if it was just a product of its time. It wasn't. You can actually read Confederate moral arguments and Unionist moral arguments. They were making moral arguments about slavery. Confederates were making arguments that slavery was better than wage labor, and Unionists were making the argument for wage labor, but they were making the arguments against slavery because humans deserve some measure of justice. Now, a lot of them weren't talking in equal terms, but still, there were even communities in the South that did not join the Unionists, but did not join the Confederates either. They went off and created isolated communities where they lived with black people in a relatively nice, free area. And I always wonder why they aren't Southern prides, but generally is. That confuses me about American culture. But yes, it's a horrifying and insightful time. You have to look at these things on those. Like I think. I mean, the terms of it is just God. I think the debate kind of ended there. The argument kind of ended there because I think there's no coming back from that. So let's move on to the next one, and this is where the actual debate even started, which was Rand's position on modeling, modeling of economics. And I think my main argument with Rand, I don't think this was disproved, so I'll posit it again. My main argument against Rand was that she models people collectively, but at the same time says you can't. She says the best society is a society which is free, because individuals are individuals. There is no such thing as groupthink or society think. And then at the same time, she says that will result in a better society, socially better thing, collectively something better. And I think that's silly. I think that's logically just a logical fallacy. That's patent, right? It's fundamentally patent. That's wrong, right? Right? I mean, Jesus. That's that main point. I don't think that was addressed, so I'll leave that on as the theme of that theme, as the point of that theme. But the next argument was Kant, and I was wrong in this. I thought that Kant posited that he couldn't say anything about the objective world, even the point that it existed. Now, I read Kant a long time ago, and I read him a couple of times, but a long time ago. And what that position is actually Hegel's position, and I was conflating it with Kant's. I was displacing it to Kant because I agree with it more. That was my issue. And yeah, I was wrong in that. Kant did think you could say that the objective world exists, but he said that's it, that's all you can say about it. Rand posits a more direct relationship between sense and objective reality. And the issue with that is you can't really say anything about simulation theory. You can't say anything about a randomly generated universe, which quantum physics is kind of preaching right now. You can't really say anything about time, the philosophy of time, like, because if you're being so sternly objectivist, then we don't experience past and future objectively. There are memories, and we don't experience future at all. So it kind of begs a presentism, which is kind of dead in light of Einstein's theories. Like, if you accept Einstein, you kind of have to kill presentism. There are things that I disagree with. I think a good metaphor for this is, I think Rand is on a train track, and human thought is on a train track. We are limited in the direction we have to go, but in not accepting the fact that she's on a train track, she can't see the fields to the left or the right of her. She can't see all that landscape. And I think that's my fundamental problem with her epistemology. And that's all I say about that. On to okay. Now onto my modeling of um, yeah. We'll talk about this first. My model of philosophy, my alternative model of economic philosophy, which I presented, was a Marxist model, and it was I was defending my position as an anarcho-syndicalist, but on the terms of socialism, because I think that anarcho-syndicalism is a very socialist position. So if you kill socialism, you kill the anarcho-syndicalism. So if you prove socialism wrong, or Marxist modeling of philosophy of economics wrong, I can't be an anarcho-syndicalist. I failed. I don't think anyone proved it wrong. I think there was arguments made against it, and the argument made against it, the one that I remember, and the one that I keenly remember, was the idea that Marx is wrong because if you get rid of the managerial role, if you claim that that's something that is done that isn't a labor, then you can't have work, you can't have mass industry, and there is in and anarcho. This is a point of where syndicalism comes in terms of socialism and how these things interact. How you separate the work of logistics and managerial work and the work of the control of means of production. Uh, I think that what's happening here is that the interlocutor is conflating the logistical labor and the control of means of production. I think you can have managers. I think you can have people who tell, who say we need, who say we need X amount of rebar produced on a Tuesday. Who say to get to X amount of rebar produced on a Tuesday to get to X amount of bridges. I think you can get people who say you need to take these routes, or you need to take um, I think you can get logistical uh, people who affect the conveyor belt, and who develop the conveyor belt systems, and who develop how the arrangements are made of work, but the production in and of itself, that is controlled by the laborers, and that can be controlled through syndicates, through uh, democratic representatives, direct democracy, which is what I mean by syndicates. I think you're conflating a bit there, and I think that's the real tension there. So I don't think that's an accurate critique of anarcho-syndicalism or socialism, to be fair. Uh, Although, to be really fair, I will say that that's an accurate critique of Marxist-Leninism. That's an accurate critique of Russian socialism, or what they call socialism, communism of Stalin and Lenin. They got rid of all those managers. They killed all them. They conflated them with the bourgeois. And Marx didn't make that delineation well in Capital. So I think there is a point to be made there, but I think that's a poor way of making it, and I think you're directing it the wrong way. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think it's an essential problem of the Marxist model. I think it's just a detail that was left out and a conflation error. You know, a manager doesn't have to control the means of production. What else have we got? Oh, and finally, we get to the last thing that we were talking about, which was moving resources. Now, I brought this up directly to test the free market model, and this was specifically because this is a moving resources is a very basic and very fundamental thing that is used to teach a lot of people that are going into property law. It's a very common analogy. You probably hear about it in terms of the deer who is hunted and killed on one property, moves and dies on another property, and then the question comes at who owns the deer in that situation. And then in legal terms, it usually comes down to legal precedent and stuff like that. So it's very subjective, and I think that we got to that position in the end of the argument, and I think that's very un-Randian. After all, Randy is the objectivist. The example I gave was coke factories in India, because in India there are coke factories that they require water resources, so they build the factories upstream because they know that they will eat up that resource, and there's villages downstream. Those villagers will then need to work in that factory because they lose a lot of they lose that resource. They can't farm anymore. They don't have water anymore. They have to buy it, and to buy it they need to get money, and to get that money they need to work in that coke factory. And that's horrific, and I don't like it, and that was the example I was bringing up. And again, like I said, we got to a point where I think specifically Mark Pellegrino was talking about uh, subjective, the getting that into the law, property courts, and having courts look at legal precedent and stuff like that, having them decide it. And I think that's a very un-Randian position. Uh, I don't disagree with that position. I think that's a decent position to have in this case. In terms of social democrat, like, there was another person who presented the idea in a different sense. They said that it's just water rights, and if you water rights are a thing that's necessary for free market capitalism. Now, in that case, if you are drawing your line there, then I think that there is no fundamental difference between that position and social democracy. I just don't. You think that there are you think capitalism is fine, but for capitalism to be fair, you need to socially fair it. You have to fair the playing ground. You have to even out the playing ground. You know what I mean? You have to make it fair. And the only issue a person like that would have with somebody like Obama or even Bernie Sanders in his policies, not in his philosophy, but in his policies, is where the bar is set. That's the only issue that you'd have, right? Like, the only issue you have is, are black people oppressed? Do we need affirmative action? That's the only issue we'd have. Not that affirmative action is fundamentally a bad thing or is inoperable, just that it's not dealing with us. It's not necessary. That's the only problem I think you could have with that in that situation. EPA, same thing. You would have to argue that climate change isn't a big problem. You can't argue that the EPA is authoritative. And I don't know. I don't see if you read that out of Rand, I don't get it. I just don't get how you got there. That's it. I mean, that was the end of it. On the whole experience, it was good. I learned a bit. I learned how to talk to objectivists. I know what they mean when they say the words. Uh, I forgot the words now. I know what they mean when they say the words altruism. I was thinking utility. I know what they mean when they say the words altruism, and when they say the words selfish now, and it's not the words I thought they meant. And cool, I can human now. I think that's fine. I wasn't I wasn't I wish I could say that it was thoroughly productive and we were getting at a logical point. We were progressing on this logical scale, and we were getting at truths that we could all agree on these objective truths. And but we weren't. I don't think there were moments of clarity though that gave me hope. Specifically, when we got at the crux of an issue, there were times when we just got at the core of it, the core of the tension between our philosophies. And I don't know, there was a humanizing moment there. Like, there was specifically, I can think of a time where um, we were talking about how labor is exploitative, and I said, and somebody said that, well, in free markets, laborers will compete, and they would achieve good labor for them if as long as they're free. And I said, well, the issue with that is I don't think they're free enough in a capitalist system. And there was, I don't know, it felt like there was a cathartic moment of just understanding the differences and how human how human the positions were. I don't know, like it was cool in that sense. I will remember that as a human. It'll be formative. It'll be tucked in my brain. So when the culture wars come, I won't be mean to the bourgeois capitalist scum.